Welcome back to a new episode of Digital Business Models podcast produced by 4Week MBA. In this session, I cover the history of Amazon. I do that with an incredible voice. I do that with Brett Stone. You might remember Brett Stone for a great book which is called The Everything Store. And this is the history of Amazon of the early days, how the company went through the dot-com bubble and actually how it thrived eventually. But Breston is also a journalist who has been covering the tech industry for decades, and he's an incredible author and researcher, one of those people that you want to talk to because he's able to uncover incredible stories behind the companies that he writes about. And he's been the author of The Everything Store, Amazon Unbound, which instead is the history of Amazon in the 2010s going forward up to these days, and then also author of the Upstarts. But in this session we cover the history of Amazon and also how this crossed, of course, with the history of Jeff Bezos. It's an incredible conversation. Brad is really one of those people that is able to tell you the story, the whole story in an objective way. And so it's very interesting to look at the history of Amazon from the early days, a few key things, and also a few key things about Jeff Bezos' life. So, Brad, thanks for joining this conversation. It's a huge pleasure to have you here.
Thank you, Gennaro. Good to be here.
Yeah, the topic of this conversation is actually the whole story of Amazon, and you put together like research in two great books. One is The Everything Story, the one is Amazon Unbound, and the story of Amazon is very complex, and together with the story of Jeff Bezos, if you had to actually first of all, how did you get to it, and actually how would you break down in waves, I guess, the story of Amazon?
Well, how did I start it? I covered Amazon as a beat reporter for the New York Times. Actually, first for Newsweek magazine. Started covering Amazon in the late 1990s. Covered the company for the New York Times. Was writing about the first Kindle, the fight with book publishers, the emergence of cloud computing, in the late 2000s, early 2010s. And I think I just saw maybe a little bit earlier than most people that this company was more interesting than the world thought. The world initially thought of it as an online bookseller and then an unprofitable online retailer, but really it was a technology company that had established a beachhead and was moving in interesting ways and disrupting the business world as it went. People thought it was unprofitable. In reality, it was investing its profits in new technologies. And it was all led by a rather ruthless and interesting and idiosyncratic guy in Jeff Bezos. And so looking for, a book project, I pitched it to Bezos, and he sort of allowed me, and this was the first book, The Everything Store, allowed me to talk to his colleagues and family members. And the story was fascinating, and then I just kind of got hooked to it. The first book, is the origin story. It's the story of the rise and then the near fall during the dot-com bust, and then the resurrection, and Bezos's emergence as a disruptive business visionary. And so you asked how I would break it down. I mean, that was just generally like naturally how it happened. The first book came out in 2013, and I thought I was done. But then what happened was, this resurrection went much farther. Amazon was turned into one of the tech giants, the behemoths that are kind of scaring competitors and regulators and smaller companies, fighting with unions, and expanding internationally. And so that was the second book. It kind of takes us from 2010 to the present. It's the story of the rise in Amazon's market capitalization from 500 million to now over 500 billion to over $1 trillion. It's also a little bit the story of Amazon coming back down to earth. We're talking on a day when the Amazon stock over the last year is probably down by 40%. So it became big and then had to contend, I think, with some of the secondary effects and unintended consequences of its size. And it's also the story of Jeff Bezos's evolution from the geeky guy that we all remember who was selling books online to one of the titans, the richest people in the world, who's swirling in a fair amount of controversy.
Yeah, and you touched a very interesting point, especially about Amazon of the early days, and I think it's very important because you said, initially many people were very skeptical. They looked at Amazon and they thought Amazon was an e-commerce company. And in reality, in part, they were correct, meaning that there was a huge change, right? In terms of the way Amazon also changed its own playbook before and after the dot-com bubble, right? Are there like any events or like anything that you want to tell us about that, the way Amazon changed throughout that time?
During the dot-com bust.
During the bust.
I think it exceeded a kind of desperation. If you go back to 2000, 2001, this is material that's in the Everything Store. It was a huge comeuppance for Jeff Bezos. Remember, he was Times Man of the Year at the end of 1999. Amazon was celebrated. And it then very quickly became the poster child for a kind of hubris, where folks just thought that the Silicon Valley had overinvested in these new business models. And all of the air came out of the bubble. And if you remember, even the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, was momentarily investigating Bezos for insider trading. Nothing ever came of it, but you think back, he was almost criminalized. There were analysts that were predicting the company would go out of business. There was here he was, at one time king of the world, synonymous with internet innovation, now kind of ridiculed. But there was something very real, and there was a desperation to kind of figure out how to get out of it. And one of the things he said to his employees back then is the only way out of this is to invent our way out. And so when I say a kind of desperation or even an ingenuity came out of it, that's when they started thinking about, well, the Amazon marketplace. Okay, so one of I think the most important things about the history of Amazon is their realization that, like, okay, what we do selling books or selling things online isn't that good of a business. Like Bezos almost picked the worst business model of the new age, right? Google and Facebook and all these other companies had very high margin businesses. Bezos was a low margin, tough business. And so they realized that and they said, okay, well, how can, we're in these desperate straits. How can we take what we do and use it in other ways? And when you look at all the things Amazon's done, it's always been an answer to that question. So the Amazon marketplace, well, we sell things. Maybe we can sell the things from other companies, or cloud computing. We managed to run a internet operation that gets historic levels of traffic, particularly over the holidays. How can we take that expertise and sell it to other companies? Or the Kindle. We have the biggest book selling business. How can we sell books in another way and make it even more convenient? And so I just think it was the desperation of those years that made them get very good and very strategic, and it's carried through to this day.
Yeah, and actually, I think there was a moment where Amazon was really about. On the one side, analysts were right in looking at Amazon and thinking it could fail because, especially in the transition throughout the dot-com bubble, they managed with a very lucky timing also to get funding to actually have enough cash to survive those periods. And also, I guess, I don't know if you can confirm the playbook of Jeff Bezos changed substantially, because before the dot-com bubble, actually, he was investing in a lot of new ventures. It was very aggressive, right, in terms of investment and placing bets on the internet. And some of those failures are known, but at the time before the crash, actually was very, very
right.
aggressive. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, in the 90s, I mean, Bezos was like he's always been the most optimistic guy about the changes the internet is bringing. And so early on in the 90s, they just decided, well, we can't get to everything. So let's make a bunch of bets for companies that are going to do different parts of this vision of being an everything store. And they invested in, companies selling pet food and pharmaceuticals and, all sorts of stuff. And then what they realized is if they can't control it, that the outcome's not necessarily going to be good, and they ended up losing a lot of money in those investments.
Hmm. And who were some of the key people that helped Amazon, gain traction, especially in the early days, among the first investors that you can remind?
Well, first of all, I think it's worth noting that a lot of people, when Jeff Bezos was making the rounds in 1994 in Seattle, a lot of people said no. He was kind of told, that his ideas were bad by a lot of people. So that was sort of interesting. The very first investors were his parents, Jackie and Mike Bezos, and Bezos funded it himself too, and so that's why he, when the company went public, owned around 40%, and now it's much lower. And of course, his ex-wife Mackenzie Scott took about a third of his shares. But the folks that there were a couple of wealthy Seattleites. There was one investor, probably the biggest was a guy named Tom Alberg. He was a Seattle venture capitalist, who ended up joining the board and being help really bringing a kind of maturity when Bezos was just a young CEO. He was a VC at a venture capital firm called Madrona, and then famously John Doerr, the Google board member, met with Bezos and liked his exuberance. This was back in probably 1995 or six, and he backed Amazon. But it wasn't unanimous. The idea that you could sell things online, that not a lot of people thought that was a good business. And I think Bezos thought, this is where we're going to start, and there's no telling what our future could be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So definitely John Doerr played a key role, right, initially in the growth of Amazon, I guess, also to as a key counselor of Bezos as well. How eventually Amazon did survive and actually managed to survive the first real battle against Barnes and Noble. I mean, how did he manage Amazon to get out of it and become even stronger?
Yeah, we're really going back, because of course we don't even think of Barnes and Noble and Amazon in the same sentence anymore. They're companies with just two vastly different identities. But back in the 90s, when Amazon was just a bookseller, Barnes and Noble was the giant. It was also seen by a lot of folks in the book community as kind of the evil empire, which is also ironic because they're an ally. They're seen as an ally now and a hedge against Amazon. But back then, Barnes and Noble was the giant, and there was a question in the business community: when would Barnes and Noble just start selling books online? And at one point, the founder Len Riggio and his brother went to Seattle and kind of tried to muscle Bezos a little bit, suggested kind of a sale or a partnership. Bezos met them with Tom Alberg, the venture capitalists who were just talking about, and said no thanks. And Bezos had this conviction, pretty extraordinary, I think, that that these traditional businesses weren't going to really be able to get the internet, or that the internet would be so disruptive to the way they did things that they wouldn't really be able to dig in and satisfy customers in the same way. And the idea is, like, if you're Barnes and Noble and you've got all this real estate, do you really want to undermine that investment by just packaging books and shipping them out? And it turned out they were right, that Barnes and Noble, and we saw this across the business community, like, traditional companies were slow to get the internet. Took them a decade maybe, and so that was kind of the first victory. Now, like a video game, after it cleared every level, there was a different bad guy, right? And so that Barnes and Noble might have been the first, but then it was Walmart, and then it was Google, and now it's probably Microsoft plus Google and probably Apple as well.
Mhm. Yeah, and there was a time where actually Jeff Bezos was about to, or at least probably thought to retire already after a few years of running Amazon, but then he had to get back, to run the company. How was the transition for Jeff Bezos, and to just get back to the company in the early 2000, and the way he led it going forward? I mean, when do you think there was like really a change in pace for Amazon after the dot-com bubble?
Yeah, this is an interesting time in Amazon history. We're talking about probably the year 2000. Bezos and Mackenzie had their first child, Preston Bezos, and there was this idea maybe that Jeff was going to lead out a little bit, that they would bring in a professional manager. I think it was partly personal. It was probably the board kind of nudging him aside. Back then, venture capitalists like to do that. The company stock price was cratering. There was a sense that there was a lot of internal chaos, and then they brought in a professional manager, a guy named Joe Gala from, I think it was Black and Decker. But again, this is material in my first Amazon book, The Everything Store. So it's been a while, and Gala came in. He immediately sort of kind of started to clash with all the young internet whippersnappers that Bezos had hired, and no surprise, Bezos sort of figured that, okay, this semi-retirement partnership with this other executive was not going to fly, and he came back with a full head of steam, won the battle with the venture capitalists, and this was a critical moment, because it's when he really showed them that he could adapt. This is a young Jeff Bezos. He had done nothing but grow and hire and come up with new ideas. And then, after this moment, after the stock price had fallen, after the internet crash, Joe Galley left very quickly. Bezos resumed total control, and he showed himself capable of managing the business during a downturn, but also spawning new businesses and new ideas, because it's at that moment that the internet marketplace starts. That leads to the idea of fulfillment by Amazon. What we do in these warehouses, we can do for other companies. That leads, very quickly to Prime and the promise of 2-day delivery, and then the Kindle. And this is really one of the most, I think, remarkable winning streaks in business history. I mean, I think after Apple and the iPod, the iPad, the iPhone, you'd have to say this period in Amazon history, marketplace, Prime, fulfillment by Amazon, the Kindle, and Alexa. Oh, and of course, Amazon AWS is remarkable.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but before we get to that, because of course those are extremely successful business units, and AWS has become a company in its own sake. What were some? Because many times Bezos highlighted how to get to those successes. Actually, there were many other failures. What are some of the failures that it's worth remembering that also cost Amazon a lot of money, and that were very hard to digest for Jeff Bezos?
Yeah, so the early failures, I mean, there were a lot. Bezos was like capable of chucking out a new idea every single day. And he likes to talk about some of the early attempts to copy eBay as sort of humbling failures. I mean, Amazon, that it's what led them to marketplace. So I don't really know, that you would consider it a failure, or maybe you'd say in a lot of different cases they learned from their failures and help them get to things that worked. But I don't know. There were some product categories early on that they bet big on. Jewelry is one that comes to mind that I don't think ever really turned into big businesses for Amazon. Or there were just very kind of capable other companies, independent companies that just kind of did it better. I think the jury's still out on some things that Amazon's done. Certainly, like Alexa has been a product hit and been important in the industry, but the idea of Alexa as a platform for third-party developers, I think the jury's out on that. Bezos, on his winning streak back in 2013, went on 60 Minutes to unveil the Amazon drone. And we're now nearly a decade later, and they are not yet darkening our skies. So
Yeah.
that's something that maybe I'd put a little asterisk next to. And Bezos would say that you try a lot of things, you're going to fail, and that failure is part of the innovation ecosystem. And then, of course, it goes without saying, and I tell this story in my new book, Amazon Unbound, the Fire Phone was a notorious kind of failure. And it's just interesting because there's no more powerful technology platform than the smartphone. And you look back and you go, Amazon really got that wrong. And in my book, I describe, why Bezos himself was kind of the architect of that failure. And yet you just wonder, should they have stuck it out and tried something else and kept going? Because you look at Apple right now at nearly a $3 trillion market cap. And Amazon, now all the way back down to close to a $1 trillion market cap, and it's all about the power of the smartphone, and Amazon still doesn't play there.
Yeah. So it's an important lesson to emphasize that, of course, innovation is very, very expensive, and in order for a company to come up with the successful products, business units, programs, they need to actually experiment a lot, and many of those will be cheap, many other will be very, very expensive. And you mentioned the example of the Fire Phone. I mean, I guess I'm not sure how many billions it costs the company, an effort as well, directly also from the Bezos, but it was a very expensive failure. And
I think the write-off was only like $200 million, but certainly the investment in time was larger. And then the cost that they continue to pay. I mean, just recently, by the way, they had to disable purchasing the ability to purchase Kindle ebooks on the Android app, and it's because that being subservient to Google and to Apple has put Amazon in the position of constantly having to negotiate for access to their own customers. So the real cost of the Fire Phone debacle is that Amazon has been in a strategically weakened position.
Yeah, and that's a lesson that we're learning now, that over time, at least for a scaled up company, those that survive and actually thrive are the companies that are able to control the whole supply chain of data. Meaning that if you look at Google and Apple, of course, they own the whole platform where the various products are, then distributed to users. Something that it's missing for companies like, for instance, Facebook, now rebranded as Meta, and so also in part for Amazon. But Amazon actually, the good thing is also it has built over the years some sort of distribution advantage, especially by building up the marketplace, because otherwise, without that, it would have been very, very hard to actually build, to actually maintain sustainable advantage. Because let's remember that in the early days, Amazon was built also a lot on top of Google, and I think there is a part in the book where you explain that I don't remember in which country, but anyhow, they were trying to kick things off, and they tried to do it without Google Ads, but they realized that it was not possible. They needed Google Ads.
That was in Mexico, right? They Mexico, had this expensive experiment to try to launch it without any Google advertising, and they did billboards and they had ads in newspapers, and the traffic wasn't there. And I think Bezos has said, like, Amazon is Amazon in large part because of Google. They were able to but like they also had to pay a tax. And in fact, now one of Google's biggest problems is that a lot of internet users start their online shopping on Amazon. And so there's a constant battle between these big companies over the customer.
Yeah, and I think probably one area where Amazon successfully built that sort of vertical integration is probably in ebooks, right? Because with the Kindle is an hardware, but then also the kind of format and the standard that the Kindle has created, it's something that gives Amazon a competitive advantage. Though the market for ebooks might be way I guess less interesting than other things like music or apps, which have become a multi-trillion dollar industry.
Right.
So it would be interesting to touch actually a bit of the background of the Kindle, how it got developed, what was the vision. Also because, as you explain in the book, the history of the Kindle crosses the history of also the founder of Tesla. So
That's right. That's right. This is a historical irony. People think Elon is the founder of Tesla. It was a pair of partners, Martin Eberhard and Mark Tarpenning, who way back in the 90s had a basically an ebook. What was it called? The Rocket ebook. And they met with Bezos, and he looked at it, and he was contemplating an investment. And then he thought, the technology is not quite there. And they ended up getting an investment from Barnes and Noble, and Bezos is right, and it kind of went nowhere. But a couple of years later, it really all started with the iPod and the iTunes store, and Bezos seeing his music business just get vaporized by digital music and digital downloads, and probably a bit of Napster and piracy as well. And he said, okay, well, we can handle that with music, but our identity is wrapped in books. And he had seen the Rocket ebook early, and he thought, if anybody figures this out, we're going to see the same decline in our book sales. And books at that time were the kind of engine powering Amazon's barely profitable, probably at the time sort of technically unprofitable business model. And he thought, we've got to do this. And so he starts this project inside Amazon. His board thinks he's nuts. They think he's got to focus on getting the company to profitability and not investing in crazy new things. And he manages it himself. It takes multiple years. They have a hard time getting the supplies that they need. And he micromanages the design, and he's not a great designer. So the first version of it comes out looking slightly bizarre, kind of like a big clone of a BlackBerry. But the intuition was right. And, even though it's not a big business, because frankly, people don't read as much as they watch or listen, Amazon drew a moat around its biggest business, its most important business, identity-wise, which was the book business. But I will just say, and this is really the story I'm telling at the end of the Everything Store, there was a significant cost because Amazon had to muscle the book publishers to digitizing their catalogs, and they did that in a very sort of ruthless and draconian way, often with threats. And I think it ended up probably shaping the negative reputation that Amazon carries through to this day about how it operates with partners and in the larger business community.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. And there was also, like a moment where they were trying to kick this off with by leveraging on Apple, right? But things didn't work out. Like they were trying to, have the ebooks going also through Apple, but then Apple had its own plan for
right. I mean, I think way back at the beginning of this, I think that Amazon and Apple talked a little bit about music. This was when the iPod was released, but the iTunes store hadn't yet come out. So we're talking early 2000s. And Amazon wanted to bill itself as maybe Amazon could be the store for the iPod. And Apple rejected that. Steve Jobs wanted a holistic experience. And Amazon quickly realized that Apple, was a danger to its business. And so, years later, Steve Jobs recognized he was never interested in books. He thought it was a small business. But he did recognize with the Kindle that Amazon had achieved a sort of digital beachhead, and that it could expand there and be a threat to Apple's interests in music and video. And that's when he ordered the iBooks store and a kind of competitive response. But Apple never made a digital e-reader, and I think that at that point the company sort of realized that they were going to be rivals.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and going forward, it's interesting also. I look especially at financials of companies. And try to understand their business models. And today, when I look at AWS, of course, as we said, this has become a company in its own sake. And it's interesting also to notice how the transition from Jeff Bezos to Andy Jassy actually was a transition inside the company where the CEO of AWS took over the whole company, which says it all, I guess. What's a bit of the story behind AWS? How was it conceived, and over the years, how actually Amazon saw it grow within?
Sure. This is, I just have to say, like, success has many parents, and the story I told in the Everything Store, which I talk to everyone and I'm extremely confident in, it ended up like and somehow antagonizing, I think, Andy Jassy, who led it for many years. If you recall, he and Bezos's wife at the time, Mackenzie, wrote 1-star reviews for the Everything Store. It was seen upon publication as a kind of contentious or antagonistic account, which surprised me. And I feel like the antagonism has faded over time, and the account is more embraced. But anyways, here's how I kind of saw it and chronicled it. As I described, the business of Amazon at that time, mid 2000s, was trying to find what they were good at and to capitalize on it. And at the time, they were also opening up. It was the Web 2.0 boom, and they were, Amazon had been a kind of closed world, and they were beginning to work with developers and create tools for developers. And that was anything, that were things like allow people to post, to have Amazon sales on their own website, or to tap Amazon sales data and bring it out of the company. Well, so Bezos was really thinking about how could he serve developers, and he kind of went off and in one of his sort of brilliant invention sessions realized, the thing that developers need is they need unfettered resources. He had seen it inside Amazon. The way you constrain innovation is you limit their computing power or their access to computers or their processing power. So he thought, what we need to give developers are building blocks, the pieces to construct their own businesses. And he had brainstorming sessions where he would like write on a whiteboard, the primitives that Amazon would that developers would need to build their businesses, to run their businesses. Mm-hmm. So it wasn't just access to sales data or the ability to sell things on their websites. It was going to be like infrastructure. And the primitives that they came up with were things like storage and compute power and payments and databases. And basically, very similar to the Kindle, he just authorized the kind of skunk works process. And the board fought him. But at that point, he had sort of accrued the political capital from saving the company after the dot-com bust to kind of force it through. And his ownership position at the company helped. And he seeded this effort. And so AWS, which was a business that already existed to help developers, became something else. It became, we're going to create the building blocks for developers to run their businesses. And Andy Jassy at the time, he had been Jeff's shadow, and they had been kind of out of a job at Amazon. And Bezos said, "Why don't you go run this? Come up with the business plan and lead it." And that's the story. It launched with S3, which was storage, and EC2, which was cloud. And the teams had gone out and worked on this for years, and they came together and they launched it. And the timing was either lucky or propitious. It was basically the beginning of the resurgence of Silicon Valley. Whole new set of companies were being created around the global financial crisis. So you had Uber and Airbnb and all these companies, and instead of running their computing operations themselves, they did it on Amazon services. And all of the stars aligned. Amazon's competitors were kind of late to copy it. The business climate was recovering, and the technology worked. Oh, and by the way, Amazon itself, ended up being the first tester and eventually the biggest customer. So Amazon could grow these things really quickly, and that's business history. It's on track to be, I think, an $80 billion a year business this year. Which for something that isn't 20 years old is absolutely remarkable, and it's probably responsible for a lot of the corporate value that investors ascribe to Amazon today.
Yeah, and I think it's also worth highlighting that probably AWS is the first attempt of Amazon to really build a sort of platform strategy, even though at enterprise or business level, because AWS is first of all a platform which has a set of tools for doing many things, but it's a developer platform, and it's extremely powerful. And it's interesting also to see how most of the profits over the years for Amazon have come from AWS, and therefore AWS it's sort of used as the part of the company that subsidizes the other
Right.
part, which is the tight margin part, which is the e-commerce and the marketplace. So on the one side, of course, you have Amazon e-commerce, which is run for scale, and then on the other side you have AWS, which is of course run on both like scale and margins, and it's very interesting development. It's a crazy story. So
it really is, and I will say, like, this idea that AWS subsidizes retail. I mean, I think it's in some years maybe true, but my sense has always been that AWS profits go to building more AWS. I mean, it's a division that is still in total growth mode.
Yeah,
it's another business, Amazon advertising, that I think tends to kind of rescue the margins of the retail part of Amazon.
Yeah, of course, advertising, Prime, and also the third-party seller services, those are all high margins part. Yeah. The thing is, when I say subsidize, it's also simply because as we can imagine, the Amazon infrastructure, the underlying infrastructure is extremely expensive. So having AWS as underlying infrastructure, I guess, I'm not sure about that internally, but you would pay it probably in a different way. I mean, you would have way lower expenses, I guess.
Exactly. That's true. And it's one thing I think that frustrates regulators and maybe some analysts. It's that exchange of value inside Amazon. How much does retail pay for the cloud? Yeah. How do Amazon white label products benefit from Amazon advertising and high placement in the search engine? That's all totally opaque, right? The world does not know that. And if you were to split it all apart and everyone would have to pay, fair market rates, then the economics of this company look a lot different.
Yeah. And going forward to the 2010s, like especially, I think one of the most important aspects for Amazon was to try to expand internationally. What were some of the lessons that Amazon learned? I guess what were some of the really most difficult countries for Amazon to
get? Yeah, and this is I have a chapter on this in Amazon Unbound. The first phase of Amazon's international growth were the obvious countries: Japan, the UK, France, eventually moving out from there. But then it stopped for many years because Amazon was kind of trying to get its house in order and working on things like the Kindle and AWS and eventually Alexa. And then early in the 2010s, the international expansion resumed. And first it was Spain and Italy, and that was fine and went pretty well. And then they go to India. And that has been, well, actually, we should say they tried China in the early 2000s. It was one of the biggest mistakes and failures that the company made. But arguably, Amazon was never going to succeed in China. And now we're seeing that even the internet giants, the tech giants like Alibaba, are having a hard time with the government there. But Amazon tried to parlay some of its wisdom, hard-got wisdom from China into India. And it's been a 10-year journey. And similarly, I think to China, it's like it's not all that clear that the government, with its kind of nationalist tendencies, wants an American company there. and the regulatory environment has always been challenging. Amazon's never been allowed to operate as a retailer. It just has to have a third-party marketplace. Some of the things that's done to try to get around that have been penalized. My sense is that they still probably lose a lot of money in India. Mm-hmm. They've moved subsequently into Mexico, which we talked about. And the international expansion, I think, has been slow, and that part of the balance sheet, has always been challenging for Amazon. Part of it is just I think the overall international sentiment towards U.S. tech companies, and part of it is Amazon's a business of moving things, moving atoms, of getting things to people's houses, and that transportation systems and infrastructure is just different and less developed in a lot of the world.
Mm. Yeah, and in China, of course, it was very, very difficult because there was no incentive to get into market where the government was coming against you. And I guess in India and Mexico, of course, they were kind of different markets. So it was very hard internationally, as you said, to expand compared to other European markets. Going forward, what was Amazon's main growth strategy then to really get through those international markets?
I mean, I think it started as let's port the existing model over how we do things in the U.S. and Western Europe, and then ultimately there was a dawning realization that after you hit the most developed countries, it was going to be harder. And so in India they had to do things like find different kinds of transportation. They couldn't rely on the national postal carrier or the UPSs of the world because they didn't really operate there, or they were less reliable. And so, in some, like India is one of the first countries where, we see Amazon really own the last mile. And they were relying on UPS and the United States Postal Service in the US. And in India, they're hiring drivers and bicycle messengers. And now, we see Amazon vans crawling our neighborhoods in the US and in Western Europe. And it's because Amazon learned how to do it in these other countries. So they really, I think in China was critical, like in realizing the one size fits all e-commerce framework just wasn't going to work everywhere.
Yeah, and there is also another point, I think the opposite scenario where at a certain point when they saw the rise of other players like Wish, they tried to implement a model where they enabled Chinese merchants to sell stuff on top of Amazon, but they also had many backlash on that kind of strategy, right? I mean, what happened there?
Okay, so this is the marketplace, right? Yeah. Okay, so I tell the story at Amazon Unbound, and the marketplace was probably the most profitable part of Amazon's retail business. And this is allowing other companies to sell on Amazon.com. And then they realized around 2012, 2013, that they're at risk of being kind of outmaneuvered by not just Alibaba in China, but by some startups in the US, which were basically tapping low-cost Chinese goods and Chinese sellers. There's a vast explosion of entrepreneurship and ingenuity and scrappiness in China, and those companies were allowing those sellers to sell cheap things to customers in the U.S. and Western Europe. And Amazon's marketplace had primarily been regional or local. And Amazon, had to move pretty quickly to open a business or reopen a business in China where they had failed to create a local business, and to allow, to court Chinese sellers and to say, here's how easy it is to sell on Amazon, and we'll help you ship your stuff over the West, and and to catch up with those other companies. So okay, they did that, and so suddenly you had everything from $5 jeans to hoverboards, to low-cost electronics flooding to customers in Europe and America. Sounds great, right? Well, there was, as you say, a backlash because Amazon made it really easy. They were moving quickly to try to head off competitors. Their nightmare, I'm sure, was that Alibaba, the juggernaut of China, would go and establish a beachhead in the US. And so they made it really easy for Chinese sellers to sell on Amazon and probably sellers elsewhere. And they didn't have a lot of guardrails. And suddenly you had those $5 jeans were ripping after the first time you wore them, or the hoverboards were exploding into flames. That actually really happened. Or there were other dangerous products. And Amazon, like a lot of tech companies, said, oh, we're just a marketplace. We shouldn't be held responsible for these things. And, there were all sorts of lawsuits. There were, the press had a field day telling these stories. People's houses burned down in some cases because of faulty lithium ion batteries. And Amazon ultimately realized that it was going to have to take some responsibility for the products and build some safeguards into the marketplace. And it's still struggling with that because, once, as companies like Facebook, and Google have found out, like once you create a sort of anarchic anything goes forum, people get used to that and get very good at avoiding any of the rules you want to institute. So now it's a cat and mouse game.
Mm-hmm. And how do you see the issue and various complaints that Amazon, for instance, has been using the data it gathers on the platform, on the marketplace, to actually also help its own products, so the Amazon Basics products. I mean, because of course there is a key point here where, which is also a point that I guess Amazon has been making, which is about also other physical retails. You have information about the store, which products sell more in which part of the store, and all this stuff. So how is this different, if any, from
yeah, that's right. And let's kind of set the story here. About 5 years ago, Amazon, it really digs into this common move in retail, which is white label products or private label. They make their own power strips or painkillers, and they sell it on Amazon under the Amazon Basics or other brands. Now, yeah, as you say, all stores do this. And oftentimes, they look at what's selling well, or they look at industry trends to figure out what to do next. The complaint against Amazon, and I illustrate this in my book, is that the managers who were responsible for these private label products, they were getting deep in the data of third parties who are running their businesses on Amazon and looking at, okay, in the vast array of multivitamins, that you could sell, what's doing the best here? Where should we go next? And they looked at a third party retailer and they said, okay, well, look, it's like, multivitamins for kids. There's much more. There's so many SKUs, so they could get really detailed into figuring out what works. Now, Amazon explicitly said they had a policy forbidding that. And they still say that every time they're asked about it in front of Congress or in front of regulators. But the fact is, and it was illustrated in my book, and it's been shown elsewhere, that the managers who, like all managers in Amazon, are just striving to stay hired and get their bonuses, that they broke the rules, that it was very easy, that the internal safeguards weren't there. And I don't think Amazon's ever properly kind of fallen on that sword and admitted that it happened. They've tried to kind of scurry out of it, and it'll be interesting to see, because there are a bunch of regulators looking at it, whether they're really called to account for what was a little bit of internal anarchy at Amazon, and then anything goes, like put your hand in the cookie jar attitude in terms of looking at that data. I don't know that it necessarily helped Amazon, by the way. Again, it's not that hard to access public sources of data about what is selling well, but nevertheless, they broke their own rules.
Yeah, absolutely. And to close this up, going forward, how do you see Amazon, especially in light of the new edition of Amazon Unbound, and also for Jeff Bezos, what's the focus right now?
Yeah, well, thanks. That's really where we are now. It's Bezos has in large part kind of moved on to other things. He's still chairman of the board, but you just get the sense watching him that he's really more invested in his private space company, Blue Origin, which lags badly Elon Musk's SpaceX, but Bezos is spending more time there. He's fully invested now in giving away his $200 billion fortune and working on a climate philanthropy. He's also enjoying life to an extent that he probably hasn't in the past. He is out there on the town with his partner, Lauren Sanchez. And it's unclear to me how much time he reserves for Amazon. Jassy says he talks to him regularly. I thought at the beginning that Bezos was going to be a kind of active behind the scenes sponsor at Amazon with the things that interested him, like healthcare or the satellite initiative. But my sense is that Bezos has kind of moved on. He's an active board member, but no longer an operator at Amazon in any meaningful sense. And so the future for Amazon, I think, is ambiguous right now, because the company, as we've just been talking about, has thrived by always coming up with something new, by inventing the new thing, by figuring out what they've been good at and how that can be used in another way. And Bezos was the kind of inventor in chief. And he also drove these things with his own personal capital inside the company. He often in some bad directions, but he drove them. And it's hard for big companies to innovate and disrupt themselves. So can Jassy do that? I mean, he's a very respected executive inside Amazon. He's also operating in a totally different macro climate. The Amazon stock price is down 40% in a year. That creates all sorts of strains for employees who are compensated with equity. And he's a little bit less of a charismatic leader than Bezos. And he doesn't have the halo, the magical halo of being the founder. And so I don't know. I think it's interesting. It's going to be tough for Amazon. We can, though, look back at the sweep of these 25 years and my 2 books on the company and say, it has proven the naysayers wrong in the past. And so I still give it a little bit of the benefit of the doubt and feel like maybe there are a couple more tricks up Amazon's sleeve.
Yeah. It would be interesting to look at, and I guess the space company is going to be a very important focus for him. And again, it's going to be interesting to see what Jeff Bezos is going to be able to achieve from
Absolutely, he's not that old. He's 58, I think,
yeah.
And so he's still got a couple of acts left in him. At least let's hope, right? I do think he's one of the he's an iconic entrepreneur and has the resources to make a real difference. And that's where I kind of end the book. And by the way, a podcast that I did for Bloomberg called Foundering, which you can get wherever you have podcasts. And I told the Amazon story in 7 episodes. And that's where I ended. Like, I really would love to see his feet come back to the ground, because I do think, particularly with climate change, he's going to hopefully make an important difference.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks, Brad, for joining this conversation. It was a huge pleasure to have you.
Thank you, Gennaro. My pleasure.
Thank you.